thank you to the two folks that we've got joining me here, the two experts. I know some of you may not want to be called experts, but we're going to call you experts for today just to be safe here, because we do have some very smart folks in the room. First of all, we've got Dr. Christopher Nowotarski as well as Troy Kimmel, as Colleen just mentioned. So let's dive right in. First of all, and this is possibly a hot button topic here, where are you going to be on July 19th when the Twisters movie is updated, is released?
I'll let you go with that one, Chris.
I don't know if I'll be waiting up at midnight camping out by the movie theater, but I certainly plan to see it within the few days of it being released.
I'm going to probably give it a chance to die down a little bit, Justin. But
well, the excitement is obviously ramping up, and that kind of ties into, what we've been talking about and kind of teasing about with this is tornadoes and flooding, especially those two topics. Harris County is no stranger to tornadoes, and I'll get to the question I have kind of related to that in just a moment. But for Dr. Christopher, kind of talk to me about how common are tornadoes in Texas, especially in Southeast Texas? Are they becoming more common, or are we seeing a little bit of an observation bias there?
That's a great question. So first of all, Texas is the state in the U.S. with the most tornadoes. A big fraction of that is because we're the biggest state, at least besides Alaska, that gets tornadoes. But when you average that based on the number of tornadoes per square mile, though, we're not quite the largest state. But in general, we get about 150 tornadoes or so in a given year in the state of Texas. And that varies a lot from year to year. Things like El Nino, La Nina can have influences on how many tornadoes Texas or the US in general gets. Now, if you look at a graph, we've been keeping records of tornadoes, decent records since about 1950. So if you graphed the number of tornadoes per year in the United States or Texas since then, it would show a steady trend upwards. And that would make you think, oh, wow, tornadoes are getting more common. Is climate change doing this? But a lot of that has to do with observations. There's more people, population density is higher. In the early 90s, we really upgraded the radar network in the United States, and that allows us to find a lot of tornadoes that we might not have had eyeballs on. But you see the tornado on radar, the Weather Service goes out and then does a storm survey afterwards. So, but we do think, though, that we observe the most significant tornadoes, so EF1 or EF2 and greater, we do see those and saw them quite frequently back in the 50s. So when you look at a plot of just EF1 or greater tornadoes, that's actually flat over the period. So there's not an increase in those. There is an increase in the weakest tornadoes. I don't think that's actually an increase in the number occurring. That increase is represented by more observations. So in general, at least in terms of the total number in the US per year, that's pretty flat. Now, where tornadoes are occurring in the US is changing, and there's evidence that we're seeing a shift from what we typically think of as Tornado Alley, Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. So maybe decreasing tornadoes there over the last 70 years or so, increasing tornadoes in the Mid-South, states like Tennessee, Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi. So there are some changes, but not in the total number, but where and when. The when part too, throughout the year, when tornadoes occur is changing. So we're smack dab in the middle of tornado season in early May right now, but there's some evidence that tornadoes are becoming a little bit less common in the summertime and late spring, and more common in the fall and winter.
And correct me if I'm wrong, May is the month where the most tornadoes in Texas at least happens, correct?
Yes, so May is about 30% of Texas tornadoes happen in May.
Chris, one thing that I wanted to ask you was those tornadoes traditionally in the Southeast, there are a different variety of tornadoes in many cases. Those are the nocturnal type tornadoes, and they're not the same. In Oklahoma, there are 4 trees and 3 hills, and you can see a tornado off in the distance. It's not as easy, Chris, to see those tornadoes in North Mississippi or Western Tennessee that we've seen the last few days, and especially at night, right?
Yeah, so that's a great point. Tornadoes happen in slightly different environments. So the atmosphere around the thunderstorms that produce them is slightly different in the southeastern United States. But yeah, and that part of that difference in the ingredients makes tornadoes more likely to happen overnight than elsewhere. So that's a big devastating problem for them because people are asleep. Even if you're awake, like Troy said, it's harder to see because of things like terrain and trees. And in terms of human impacts, there's a lot less I should say construction is often more in the modular home.
Yep.
Trailer parks are more common, so and those tend to be more susceptible to greater damage from tornadoes.
That was an excellent question, and I think kind of ties into the next question that I have for you, Dr. Nowotarski. So Harris County is often cited as being the county in Texas with kind of the most tornadoes when you're looking at square mileage, right? So what are some of the biggest differences between the tornadoes that tend to happen here in the Houston area and what happens in the plains, in the Panhandle, for instance, where you get those big, EF4, EF5 sort of tornadoes?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And in fact, before you asked this question, I wasn't fully aware that Harris County had the most. One reason, like you said, it's one of the larger counties in Texas, space-wise and the number of people, so there's a greater chance of observing tornadoes in the county. But even when you adjust for the size of the county, it still ranks quite highly in terms of Texas tornadoes. So Harris County and Southeast Texas in general are interesting because you sort of have multiple tornado seasons and different weather regimes that can lead to tornadoes. So this time of year, you have sort of what we call supercell thunderstorms, which are a type of springtime thunderstorm in general that produce often the more intense tornadoes. So those are happening in Southeast Texas this time of year during the typical season. And this is something my research group does a lot of work on. In the fall, there's tornadoes associated with landfalling tropical storms. So Hurricane Harvey had produced over 52 tornadoes in the US, and most of those were in Southeast Texas. So a lot of tornadoes we don't think of hurricanes and tornadoes as the same, and they're certainly different. But on the outer rain bands of hurricanes as they make landfall, you can actually get lots of tornadoes. And that leads to an interesting warning problem, which we maybe get into later with the flooding risks for hurricanes versus tornadoes. And then also we often see the southeastern United States, and in a lot of ways, Harris County and Southeast Texas have more in common with states like Louisiana and Mississippi than they do with Oklahoma. So even different regions of Texas have different sort of patterns in terms of the tornadoes. So often in the wintertime, December, January, we're seeing tornadoes in the sorts of events that produce lots of tornadoes in Mississippi and Alabama, but we're sort of on the upstream end of that and can get those even in the winter here.
Yes, the folks watching in from Deer Park or Pasadena are probably going, what are you talking about? Just early in 2023, we had I believe, an EF3 that kind of ripped through Southeast Harris County. So it does happen. We do get some stronger tornadoes, but there are, generally speaking, some big differences between what we see here in Harris County and what they see out in the plains. Thank you so much for asking that. So the last kind of tornado-centric question that I have is related to tornadoes and if there is any sort of link to a warming climate. Is there a lot of science or data that suggests that tornadoes are either becoming more common or, intensifying, I should say, when we're talking about climate change?
Yeah, so again, the total number of tornadoes in the US, and we often focus on the US because we've got lots of resources to observe them, but the US is actually the hotspot in the world for tornadoes. There are other parts of the world that can get tornadoes, and climate change may influence which parts of the world start to get more or less tornadoes, but we tend to do most of our research focusing closer to home. But so in the US, the numbers aren't changing, but where in the US, we've already seen this shift towards the east. Now, whether that's entirely due to climate change or not is still an open question, although there's some hints that maybe climate change is at least part of that shift in the location. The times of the year, again, we're sort of seeing this broadening of tornado season earlier into the winter. And some of that might be due to climate change making, one of the things you need for tornadoes is you need relatively warm, moist air near the ground. So being especially close to the Gulf Coast, if the Gulf of Mexico sea surface temperatures are a little warmer earlier in the year, that can help lead to conditions that make tornadoes more likely earlier in the year. There's some hypothesized reasons why distributions might be changing specifically for tornadoes. We're also sort of seeing, again, so far, and some evidence into the future that tornadoes, even though we might have the same number of them total, they might occur in more clusters. So fewer days where there's a tornado, but on days where tornadoes occur, we might see more tornadoes and more intense tornadoes on those days. So tornadoes organizing more into outbreaks, these higher end events where you're seeing 10, 15 tornadoes or more on a given day.
And it should be noted that when we're talking about weather and climate, those are two different things. So kind of the easiest way, and I think the easiest to understand way to explain climate and weather is your kind of day-to-day sort of mood, whereas climate is your kind of your birth, your given sort of personality, then whatever the personality or the disposition is that you have, that's kind of the difference. So weather is day to day, climate is the average of those day to day kind of weather swings over the course of at least 30 years, typically a lot longer than that. Thank you so much for answering that question. I know there's not a terribly big connection or not an obvious correlation, if you will, between tornadoes and climate change. But that may be a little different. We'll talk about that, Troy, with flooding. So first of all, talk about where you're at in this state. So you're in the kind of the heart, if you will, of Flash Flood Alley in Central Texas.
Yeah. This area sees a lot of flash flooding type of events, Justin, and a lot of that. I mean, flooding is flooding, and we as we have this talk with everyone today, we still have the San Jacinto River, the Trinity River, and all these that are still very high and have affected a lot of people. Flooding is flooding, but the flooding we get here tends to be more quick onset, quick offset, not always. And then this stuff that we're seeing in Southeast Texas today is more of the river or the basin type flooding. It still has the same effect. I can tell you, having grown up and having relatives down near Alvin during Tropical Storm Claudette many years ago, to see a house with water up to the second story in it, that it doesn't do houses or residential units any good. I mean, it still has the same effect, if not more. But I think it's kind of a different monster, Justin, around Austin. A lot of that is related to very simply just a lot of the subsoil limestone layers that are particularly along and west of I-35 associated with the Balcones Escarpment. You can look out here. If you plan on, when I first got over here after I left A&M and came back over here a number of years ago, I went out in the hill country to put a rain gauge up one day and got out of the truck with a shovel. And the guy that's looking at me said, "What are you going to do with that?" And I said, "I'm planning on putting up this rain gauge." He said, "You got a box of dynamite?" He said, "You're going to need it because that's how much soil we have. And you've got to get into the ground. And that subsoil limestone layer, especially along and west of I-35, is extremely important." Chris will tell you how important the increased urbanization happens to be with the flash flooding around Austin. And by the way, we're going to get back to that when we get to Houston as well, because that's also another issue. And again, just the hilly nature of the Texas Hill Country. You put limestone layers out there, and then you have all these hills, water runs downhill. It's not going to be, especially at very high rainfall rates, it's not going to be absorbed very quickly by limestone, trust me, and it's going to end up running off. Meanwhile, in Houston, we just had these huge amounts of rainfall back up on the San Jacinto and Trinity River, and that water had to go somewhere. And guess where it ended up, especially getting down there into the north and eastern parts of Harris County and adjacent areas, especially north and east. A different type of flooding, but just as serious. At least river flooding, basin flooding occurs, uptick is a little slower. People, I think, have a chance to react to it. Our big problem around here is the flash flooding and how quickly that occurs, especially at night, Chris. Out over the Texas Hill Country, you get these heavy rainfall rates. People don't see it. We had a Deputy Hollis, Travis County Sheriff's Office, that died in a flash flood while she was simply checking a low water crossing a few years back. So we lose people every year in Flash Flood Alley. And this is sort of where that slogan from the National Weather Service came from: turn around, don't drown, particularly with these flash flood events. So it's all flooding, Justin, but there's two different types basically in Houston and so forth.
As cheesy as that saying is, it is absolutely true. You know, and anyone over the last couple of days and weeks in the Houston area or north that have seen floodwaters, if you've driven through them, you probably have learned a very valuable lesson, unfortunately, probably a very expensive lesson as well with that. So, you know, we're talking about flash flooding, and obviously kind of when I'm looking at or thinking about flash flooding, the kind of flash flooding that the Hill Country sees, Austin, San Antonio, all the way stretching up towards Dallas, Fort Worth, and the Red River Valley, I kind of have in my mind images, if you recall, if you're a weather nerd watching, hopefully you are, from a few years ago. I don't remember exactly the year. Ellicott City in Maryland, just torrents of water coming down. That's really kind of, I think,
Yeah.
the thumbprint or the characteristic, I think, of flash flooding in hill country, correct?
Right, it is. And I want to mention real quick, Justin and Colleen and Chris as well, that we do see that type of flooding in Houston because of the urbanization of the city.
Yes.
So you get heavy rainfall rates, you can have flash flooding. I don't want to mean to say that you don't see that. We do see that, especially as an urban effect. And then we've got this thing that Chris talked about just a couple of minutes ago. We got this little thing called the Gulf of Mexico down to our south, and you've got the birthplace for tropical cyclones. And one thing that we have seen that I think is going to be interesting to see, and I think Chris, some folks in y'all's department, actually, Dr. John Nielsen Gammon, who's our state climatologist, and others have talked about one thing that we've seen the last few years. And I hate to say this going into the hurricane season for Houston, but we have seen cases of these tropical cyclones that, and what this is related to exactly, Chris may have more information to, where they start to move on shore like we saw with Harvey, and they lose their steering currents. When you start seeing these tropical cyclones with excessive rainfall rates, and then you slow these things down like we saw with Harvey, Chris, in the days before Harvey came in, I remember seeing the QPF, which is the forecast from the Weather Service on total rainfall. We didn't believe the 10 to 15 inches. And when it got to 40 and 50 inches, we said, that's completely out of line. And you're right, it was out of line. It was too low. So, I think we have to look at that. And I think that goes back to some degree, Justin, to city planning and things like that, the way we do things in Houston and where we build. Everyone, especially in Houston, needs to know how much elevation they have on their property. And I think this is maybe a thing to come, because that loss of steering currents may be related somewhat to a changing climate.
And Harvey is certainly not the only one. Obviously, it's the most obvious because we're in Texas. But I mean, you go back to 2019 with Dorian, you go back to, I believe, 2018 with Florence, just monumental amounts of rain and very little movement.
Yep. But you got to give Harvey the crown on that one.
Harvey's the winner, yes.
That one took that one was amazing.
Yeah. So, in recent weeks, Southeast Texas, really all of Texas has in some form, especially from basically I-35 East, has been dealing with flash flooding in some capacity, right? Just because of the number of storms or storm systems that we've kind of come through this area. But 10 to 20 inches of rain in spots north of Houston, Huntsville, I'm thinking of parts of Trinity, Liberty County as well, San Jacinto, and Walker County, seeing that rain over just the last 2 weeks or so after a very wet April. Is this kind of is there a climate connection there, or is this just something that's unfortunate timing?
Well, I mean, we are in our spring months. Like Chris pointed out, this is tornado season. And guess what? We get our heavier rain. One thing, too, that at least going into this, maybe not so much over East Texas, but number one, the Weather Service, I think, was on the ball with this, looking at this flood event. Have friends at the West Gulf River Forecast Center, Chris. We both do. And they were calling this thing out, talked to one of them, and they said there may be a rain bomb of 10 to 12 inches in this area overnight. It was about a week ago. And we saw that overnight in some of those counties to the east and southeast of Bryan College Station, more into parts of Southeast Texas. So you got to remember what time of year it is. And we go from there. What worries me is all this excessive rainfall, Chris, that we've seen this spring. And now we're sitting on the doorstep of May 15th or June 1st with the hurricane season. And that worries me.
Yeah, and I think, Troy, you nailed it on the head when you said with hurricanes, lack of steering currents potentially is a relation to how things might change in the future. And this goes for thunderstorms too, and the heavy flash flooding rainfall from thunderstorms. So the way that it's hypothesized, and we're still doing lots of research to try to nail down the details of this and test these theories, but we have a pretty good handle on the idea that rainfall rates, how fast it rains or how fast it accumulates, that's probably going to go up as a function of climate change, but as well as the steering currents may weaken. So the jet stream drives the show for a lot of these weather events. The faster the jet stream, speaking very basically here, but the faster the jet stream, the faster these things move through. And the first rule of precipitation forecasting, Chuck Doswell has a great paper on this, is basically it's simple logic. It rains the most where it rains the hardest and for the longest. So what the rainfall rate is and how the duration is. So both of these things could be affected. Durations of events could go up because things are moving slower. and the rainfall rate go up because at a very basic level, when the air is warmer, something we call the saturation vapor pressure goes up, which means in layman's terms, that means the air can hold more moisture. So for the same strength of a storm, more rain will fall out of it. So if things are raining harder and moving slower, that's a recipe for more flooding.
Well, I find it interesting, Colleen and Justin and Chris, that we're sitting here talking about this, about too much rain in some cases. It hadn't been that long ago that a good part of the state was in drought. And even here in Austin, we've been slow to the party. We haven't gotten the rain we need just yet. I'm afraid to say that at this point, because I'm afraid we'll get it all in one night. But, one thing too is these very dry soils around here of late, they've been baked essentially. And we saw some flash flood related problems in drought that people were kind of thinking you wouldn't see. But when that ground's dry, at least initially, it tends to shed a lot of water before it has a chance to kind of soak it in. And so we've seen that around Austin, some flash flooding in cases where you wouldn't expect it to have seen it. But I could use a little more rain here, Chris, if you can arrange that, or somebody can in Austin. We need a little more, not a flash flood.
Yeah, I know. When I first moved here, I've been in Texas for 10 years, and this is after the big drought of 2011. People thought Lake Travis would never fill again.
Yeah.
2015, heavy rains, Lake Travis is overflowing. But now again, we're back to Lake Travis still needs some more water. I think the hill country is still in a pretty bad drought.
Yep.
Some of this variability is normal, but there is some evidence, again, that needs a lot of work still to really nail down the details, that maybe the extremes, we're moving away from the middle and a little bit more toward the extremes. So the averages are more or less the same in certain places, but how that average is experienced is very different.
Well, and without looking, sorry.
No, I was going to say, Justin, as a follow-up to that folks, it will behoove us to remember that in the state of Texas, our biggest issue over the next 100 years, believe it or not, I feel sorry for the folks north and east of Houston right now, but I'm going to tell you the biggest issue in Texas over the coming years will be water. Our state is growing too quickly, and here we are talking about too much of it in parts of Southeast Texas, but we live, as Dr. Nielsen Gammon, our state climatologist, will tell you, we live on the dividing line between the subtropical climate in the eastern half of the state, the arid or semi-arid climates to the west. And with a changing climate, that boundary can shift more in the state of Texas. And that's one thing that John has talked about, our state climatologist, that we have to be very concerned with. And I, in front of students every day, and I know that we do the same thing at A&M, water is going to be a huge issue in the coming years because of population growth in Southeast Texas and Houston and across the state of Texas, and something we're going to have to look at.
Absolutely. Colleen, keep me honest with time. I don't know where we're at in terms of time, but I do have one quick question that I know is probably going to pop up on the chat even without looking. So with all of the rain that we've had over the last couple of weeks, really, it seems like since April 1st is when the faucets turned on, what could that mean for temperatures as we go into the summer months? Because last year was my first summer here in Houston, and whew, it was rough.
Last summer was a hellish summer. I mean, it just was. In Austin, it was just, I remember, Chris, I sat at home all the time last summer. I did not want to get out in that. And of course, it depends on, what our rainfall ends up being. I don't think we're through just yet with the active jet stream over Texas. I think we've got to deal with that a little longer. But we also know that sometime about the first couple of weeks of June, the spigot, at least as far as Austin and Houston to some degree, you get into June, July, and August, and the spigot kind of shuts off, except when a tropical cyclone generally comes in or something like that, and upends the apple cart in a sense. And we, instead of wanting to get 2 or 3 inches, we get 20 inches overnight. But Chris alluded to this a few minutes ago. For people in Houston that know Austin, Lake Travis out here, there was back in the 50s, I believe, Chris, a 58-foot rise in Lake Travis overnight with a flash flood event that occurred. It was over 50 feet. That lake will fill again, and I don't necessarily look forward to that day, even though we need it.
Yep.
Colleen, as far as questions are concerned, I'm not able to see them in the chat just because I'm looking straight ahead. So if you want to start throwing them out, you let me know.
Absolutely. Yeah,
I'm sure we've got a lot.
We have had people weighing in and chiming in with some really great questions, and we can hop straight into them. So I will kind of start reading them off and let you all take the floor. The first question came in from Wade. He was asking, he said, one concern in Kingwood right now is how the level of Lake Conroe is being controlled, especially before a storm. How much confidence do those decision makers have in the weather forecasts and the potential that those impact that those storms will have?
I may let Chris kind of get on that, but I'll tell you, I think Harris County in the Houston area, very fortunate. Harris County Flood Control, Jeff Linder is a great guy that's over there. And we also have a great weather service office down in League City. We've got a very proactive office that serves the Houston area. It's just going to be something that we have to watch. We're not going to be able, weather forecasting, unfortunately, is not a perfect science. We're not quite there yet. But at the same time, it's just something we have to watch. And Chris, you have any views on that? The question?
In terms of the hydrology decisions being made, I'm by no means an expert, but I can say I echo Troy's confidence with the river forecast centers, as well as the weather service offices are very good at this. And I think Troy mentioned this before, the weather service, especially for the last 2 weeks, sort of these flash flooding events, they did a great job. Sometimes they don't do as good of a job, but this one was particularly well done. And I think over time, their skills improving. There's also an agency called the Weather Prediction Center and the Hydrometeorological Prediction Center that do these sort of long-term, 1 week, 2 week rainfall forecasts, and they issue different levels of risk for extreme rainfall predictions. And those are getting better. And part of that is being driven by science getting better and also technology getting better. It's relatively cheap to run computer models that we used to run decades ago. So we're really able to increase the amount of grid points and the detail and the amount of processes we call it resolve in these models. And we can run more of them. So we run what we call ensembles of these models. So one individual model might waffle from different run to run where things are going to be, but you run 30 of these models, and then you can look at the averages throughout them and where they sort of hone on these bullseyes. And it's sort of what we call ensemble-based prediction method is really, really showing skill in sort of these, what are sort of the average versus the outlier rainfall events we might see.
Yeah, really, one other thing too, real quick, Justin, is I believe the Weather Service has really done a very nice job with all this, but I want to mention really quickly here that everyone that's watching this webcast today, everyone out there has a responsibility as well. You've got to have a plan. My friend Kevin Clazel, who's retiring up at OU, has always said, and I want everyone that's watching today to take this to heart. No matter what you're doing, weather related or otherwise, hope is not a plan. And that's what Kevin always says. That's what we tell students. That's what we tell people in emergency management. You've got to have a plan for tornadoes and for tropical cyclones and for flooding, so that the Weather Service, when they provide the information to you, however you get that information, that you're able to make an intelligent, critically thinking type of decision for you, your family, or the people that you live with. It's really important.
I like to say prepared, not scared.
Exactly.
Yes, and actually that's a good segue. Peter in the chat, one of the viewers right now, is asking kind of along the lines of sponge cities, and if there are any plans to make any Texas cities sponge cities. That he's basically speaking about most flood mitigation control projects specifically that he sees in Houston seem to be focused on getting water into the bay rather than absorption. Can one of y'all maybe take that? What are your thoughts?
Chris, one thing that I would say is we got to go back and look at the climate layout of the state of Texas. You have you have this barrier, if you will, on the western side of the maritime tropical air masses off the Gulf, and where you get into the arid and semi-arid to the west of that. So if we're if we're looking at that, our surplus in rainfall on average from a climatological standpoint is the eastern half of the state. That's where we tend to have surplus. We get more rainfall than we lose through evaporation, essentially. To the west, we're operating at a deficit, and you get in far west Texas and we're operating in a desert deficit when you get out in far west Texas. But I'm not sure that we as a state are that far advanced. I don't know, Chris, as far as knowing what we're going to do in the future with water. We're back to this topic of water in the future in Texas. So I don't know that much about it. Maybe Chris does.
I'm going to since you mentioned sort of where you're getting these rainfall deficits, there's a great figure in that report I sent that shows this from the state climatologist report. So if I pull this up, hopefully y'all can see it now.
Yep.
So this is just showing a map of Texas over the last 130 years or so, showing each county basically what the trend in rainfall is over that period. So just as Troy said, when you get to East Texas, basically, if the Gulf of Mexico is south of you, you're going to see, in general, we have more rain overall, plus the trend seems to be towards more rain. Those areas to the west where during our typical flow is from the south, so you see coming off of Mexico, those air masses are becoming even drier. So the city, Houston is right in there in that area where we're seeing more rainfall per decade, whereas San Antonio or Amarillo are certainly going to have different concerns to worry about.
That's interesting, Chris, to look out in far west Texas, El Paso, which is in that definitely desert arid environment, to see that overall precipitation trend there.
Yeah, I would say and you have to be somewhat careful with maps like this because when you have so little precipitation per year to begin with, some outlier events can make a big difference in the long-term trends.
Yep. Well, one thing too, Justin, that I think is interesting, showing this, and you ask about the sponge cities, essentially, is what the Lower Colorado River Authority has done. West of Houston toward Austin, there's no control of the Colorado beyond Longhorn Dam, which is located in Austin. That water flows right down there. And of course, that provides a lot of water for rice farmers and people downstream. And the LCRA has worked in the last couple of years to create a diversion reservoir that's west and southwest of Houston along the Colorado. And in a way, that's what they're doing. They're pulling some of that water that ordinarily run out into the estuaries or run out into the Gulf of Mexico, and they're putting some of it aside so that they might be able to serve the rice farmers better and to be able to use some of that water that would otherwise, Justin, just simply run to the Gulf of Mexico.
And, water, while you don't want too much of it, you certainly also don't want to be wasting it. Our friends out in West Texas that kind of deal with perpetual drought know a lot about that.
Yep.
Yeah, and actually, Troy, you're in Austin. Chris, you're in College Station. Justin and I are in Houston. One of these questions, especially after looking at that map Chris just showed, is about alerts and how for an alert system. I guess statewide, I would assume, I'm pretty sure there's a resource. Chris, can you speak to some of the statewide resources people can sign up for to get alerts?
Yeah, certainly. If you can turn on severe weather warnings on your cell phone, that's the first thing to do. Every smartphone these days has a thing in the settings where you can control how many and what severe weather warnings you get. So if you're in an area that's flood prone, turn on all the flood warnings, those sorts of things. Otherwise, pay attention to your local TV stations. If there's severe weather, those are still the best places to turn because they're going to give you the localized information you need. The warnings will be scrolling across the bottom. If you're not near a TV or a radio, but you have your smartphone, the National Weather Service, weather.gov is still the best place to go. You can put in your zip code. In fact, you can set it up so it works almost like an app. They have a mobile website that you can set and put a little thing on your homepage on your phone, and it acts just like a weather app. That's probably the most reliable forecast. But that also, the Weather Service is the agency that's issuing the official warnings and the official watches. So the Weather Service is really your go-to source for both tornado warnings, severe thunderstorm warnings, flood warnings, flash flood warnings. That all comes through the Weather Service. So the other big thing too is, again, Troy mentioned, personal responsibility in terms of educating yourself. It's amazing to me how many people still just forget what the difference between a watch and a warning is. And, it's somewhat a communication issue on our part, but also before tornado season or before flooding season, it's always good to just do a little Googling and remind yourself what the difference is and what actions are appropriate for each. So a watch is something that's issued usually hours in advance or sometimes days in advance of the expected weather, and suggesting usually it's multi-county or even multi-state region that may have that over the next few hours or days. And then a warning means it's ongoing or almost certainly about to happen. So you need to take immediate action to deal with that. And that goes for flood watches and warnings as well as tornado watches and warnings.
Let's also give a shout out for NOAA Weather Radio. This is something that is so important. Folks, if you don't have a weather radio for your family at home, you can set it down to the county. I know in the past weather radios, you would get the warning for something over there, 50, 60 miles. You can program these weather radios now. And the National Weather Service Houston Galveston has a number of transmitters around Southeast Texas, including the ones up at College Station. And they do a really good job. And I have always said, I have my opinion about this, and I'm not politically correct about it, but it is the one direct way that the Weather Service has to reach out and talk to people, TV and radio people and newspaper people. Justin, this is one way to do it, but the Weather Service and the NOAA Weather Radio is a direct connect. And I believe the Weather Service ought to have an app. There's a whole program involved in that. We're not going to get involved with it today. I've tried to talk our folks at Weather Service headquarters into looking at that one more time, but NOAA Weather Radio can't be beat. You need it.
Not only that, but they're incredibly easy to program, right? Yeah. Despite whatever technological, fears you might have, they are very easy to program. They will quite literally wake just about any heavy sleeper in the event of an overnight situation. And we've seen several instances, especially with flooding in recent weeks, where flooding is occurring overnight, which is, right, far more dangerous, obviously, than when it's occurring even during the afternoon.
One thing I'll mention too, since we're talking about warnings and we've got tornadoes and flooding going on here, there's a unique, and this is a really unique situation that can often occur, especially in the Houston area, whether it's during tropical cyclones or even this time of year. What happens when you have a tornado warning and a flash flooding warning at the same time and same location? We call these TORFs, tornado flash flooding events. And this is a big problem because the advice for a flood warning is the opposite of a tornado warning. Tornado warning, get to the lowest floor of your house, get to your basement if you have one. Flood warning, you want to get as high as you can, right? So what do you do in that situation? And how does the general public know which one is the bigger risk and which one to prepare for it? And the short answer is, the only way we can improve this is by trying to limit as many of these overlapping warnings as possible, trying to reduce false alarms. So if this occurs to you, this is where advanced planning really comes in. You need to know the location you're at. If it's your home or you're renting or you live there, you want to know, okay, when there's a flash flood warning, and there have been flash floods in the past, does my house flood? If so, then you want to be worried about the flash flood warning more than the tornado. But if you know that you're far enough away from the local drainage area that is most likely to flood, then you might be more worried about the tornado warning. So a little bit of situational awareness of your own exact location, it goes a long way in those situations.
And I encourage anyone in a flood risk area, and that's for Southeast Texas, most of us, to do that homework before anything hits, right?
Right. And actually, some people in the chat are also shouting out Space City Weather, which is a good friend of the Chronicle as well. And we also have a live storm tracker when breaking weather is happening that people can be monitoring it as well. And Harris County also does have its own local alert system as well that you can sign up for. We have a couple more questions. I want to get to as many as we can. We're wrapping up. So Jennifer in the chat is asking, aside from overall rain total, how did Hurricane Harvey compare to Tropical Storm Allison? How are they different? Yeah, those are two very different storms. I guess, Troy, do you want to take that one?
I would, except I have a hard time remembering yesterday. Bottom line, I think back, my days go back, Chris, to even the early 80s with Alicia, in Houston. I was doing some work for what was KFMK there in Houston radio station, 98 FM. And we were on the air with that. And it just seems like if you don't think you'll get a surprise from a tropical cyclone when a hurricane comes, there's never one that's going to be like the previous one. And you've got to have those plans. You've got to know it. And I think as Chris pointed out, and Justin, you did as well, folks, if you're especially in those lower elevations around Galveston Bay, back up across I-10 into northeast areas of Harris County in that area, you have got to know your elevation. You cannot afford to wait until you are forced to figure that out at some point in the future. So that's part of your plan, in a sense. So how did every one of those, Alicia and Allison, were all different. Allison, if I remember correctly, Chris, and again, yesterday, I'm having a hard time with that. Allison is the one that I believe came back a second time. And I mean, it was like you're sitting there going, really? It's going to come back to the coast again, you know, and so everyone's a little bit different. Harvey was the one that I still think kind of taught us a lesson. You slow these things down, you stall them at landfall. Also keep in mind too, and I think Chris kind of alluded to this, folks, we're not just talking about the strongest hurricane that we see with these, like with Alicia. The heaviest rainfall, unofficial record in Texas, belongs to a tropical storm, Claudette, many years ago down in Alvin at the old Weather Service office down there. This was not a real strong system, but it was a very efficient rainfall producer. So
yeah, I'll say even Harvey was a major hurricane at landfall down in Rockport, Port Aransas area, but when it was causing the most problems for Houston, it had significantly weakened, and that became a rainfall producer. And so even within the same hurricane, they have sort of different phases of their risk, right? So Harvey is the poster child for this, you know, strong winds, heavy storm surge that really ravaged the Corpus Christi, Port Aransas area. Houston was the inland flooding and tornadoes. And then again, even days later inland in the Mid-South in Tennessee, it had other tornado outbreaks associated with it. So you really, depending on the history of the hurricane, it can cause different hazards for your location. And another aspect to this too is often you think, okay, well, I survived Harvey and that was a Cat 4. But you might not have been in where the Cat 4 effects were. You might have been farther away from the center. So a Cat 2, when you're in the center, could be much more of a risk to you in the future. So just because it's something weaker on paper than you've survived in the past doesn't mean your effects at your location will be less that time around. It could be much worse.
Yep. Another part of it is, you know, we've made the shift in talking about these events as impact based. So don't get caught up in category, whether it's a hurricane or a tropical storm, as we've kind of talked about already. Focus on the impacts, right? How much rain are we going to get? Are we going to get storm surge? Are we going to get wind? Are we going to get tornadoes? In the event of landfalling tropical systems in general, we can get all of those. So focus on the impacts for your area.
One thing too, Justin, that we've got to remember going into this hurricane season, tropical cyclone season ahead, is that please remember that a hurricane, I grew up plotting latitude and longitude of the center of tropical cyclones. Chris did the same thing. We did that. A hurricane is not a point. It is not a point. It is a fairly wide system with a lot of varying weather within it. And so as we come into this hurricane season, I encourage people of Houston to look at it that way. It's a larger system. Now, where you sit in that, just like Chris said, will determine the severity and the types of weather you see. There are less, I hate to even say that, though. I say there are less severe parts of hurricanes, but I say that, and then we find out in the next storm that it was worse there. So I'm going to back off from that.
Well,
Actually,
I'm
may
sorry,
I,
Justin,
go
ahead.
Very quick. You know, when Hurricane Ian impacted Florida, I was in Florida at the time. Yeah. One of the things that I heard most commonly from residents that stay behind was that they really regretted not leaving, not evacuating when that storm surge, when that evacuation warning was issued. So if you're in Galveston, heed that warning. If it's a mandatory evacuation, it's a mandatory evacuation for a reason.
And you can look, and Chris will tell you this as well. Folks, it would scare people if you knew how many hours we know that it takes to evacuate Galveston Island. Austin's one of the cities for our friends in Galveston. We're a refugee city for that. And folks, that time to leave the island and evacuate is longer than hurricane watches and warnings are generally in effect. So you have to have that plan, like Justin said, ahead of time, and you've got to get down to it. I agree completely, Justin. I've seen people say, wow, now the winds are blowing at 70. I wish I'd left. Maybe next time, remember that. Get out of there when they ask you to do that. In Texas, we cannot order people out of their home at gunpoint. You cannot do that. We can ask people to evacuate, but we can't force people to leave.
Absolutely. And on that note, I think y'all touched on it. You know, having a plan is probably the most important thing you can do as an individual. And I think that this is the perfect kind of ending question, because there's only so much you as the individual can do, especially when we live in Houston or, you know, in Central Texas or wherever you're hit, where there's a lot of danger that can be found. One person in particular, William in the chat, is asking different solutions being considered, such as like widening the bayou, making tunnels, all of these kinds of really big grand projects. Are any of them actually viable within the next 5 to 10 years?
I don't know of any of plans, and I don't know how much it would help, because our population growth every day, we're putting more and more impervious cover basically in place around the Houston area. The Houston area continues to grow, and that just is going to run off more of that precipitation and have a greater effect. I don't know of any plans, particularly for the Houston, Texas area or Southeast Texas.
I do know there are some people in city officials, city and county officials for that matter, that are specifically titled, if you will, to keep an eye on and to kind of brainstorm how we can adapt, right, to whatever Mother Nature may throw at us next. We know that it's raining heavier and it's raining harder in some areas of Texas, of course, right here in Houston, one of those spots. So how can we adapt? Because that's really the only thing we can do at this point. We can't fully stop it. We can adapt, though, our infrastructure. Now, how successful those things are is a different question entirely.
Absolutely. So all the more reason that with that, I think everyone on this call would say, have a plan, be prepared, you know, follow the Chronicle, follow Space City, follow all of these departments at A&M and UT that are doing the research, and have all the resources available for the entire state. And, you know, of course, here in Houston, we'll be following it locally for you all. We are just pretty much at about time. I'm sure we could have about 3 other more of these with our experts. And I want to say thank you again to Troy and Chris and Justin for your expertise. And, you know, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you all. I know our readers had a lot of questions that we did not get to go through, but we will forward them on to y'all. We at the Chronicle will keep looking at them, and Justin and his team will probably be writing a lot of follow-ups based on your neighborhoods. I saw Meyerland had a lot of questions, and other areas as well. So gentlemen, thank you so much. And we hope all of you stay safe and dry and have a great week. Anything else you all want to say? Thank you.
Yeah, Justin, good to see you. Chris, good to see you. Colleen, nice to meet you, and all the folks out there that are watching us today, are listening to us. Great to have you all on the call.
A big thank you to everyone involved.
Yeah.
I thank you again for inviting me, and great chatting with all of you. And yeah, I'm really thrilled at the turnout you all have, and I love talking about the weather. So anytime you want to do more of these, I'm always down to chat about the weather.
Anytime I can
this upcoming storm season is going to be a big one. So we definitely anticipate hearing from Chris and Troy, both of y'all, on another one of these calls. I'm sure it won't be the last. We'll continue the conversation moving forward. So thank you so much, guys. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Bye.